Jonathan sat on the park bench, staring at his phone with growing dread. The videos of the incident had already gone viral, and his face was plastered all over social media. Each comment felt like a sharp jab. How can someone be so disrespectful? This guy is a disgrace. The Royal Guard deserves a medal for dealing with this clown. Imagine thinking it's funny to mock tradition. Karma really came through. Jonathan's confidence, which had been sky-high earlier, was now crumbling. He never thought his harmless prank would spark such outrage. At first, he tried to convince himself that people were overreacting. "It's just the internet," he muttered, brushing imaginary dirt off his pants. "They'll forget about this in a day or two." But as he kept scrolling, it became clear that this wasn't going away anytime soon. News outlets were picking up the story, framing it as a lesson in respect and professionalism. Headlines like, "Royal Guard shuts down disrespectful tourist without breaking character," and "Karma strikes back." When tradition meets entitlement began popping up, Jonathan's stomach churned. Meanwhile, back in the square, Marcus stood as firm as ever, maintaining his composure despite the day's drama. The crowd around him had thinned out as the evening approached, but those who remained couldn't stop talking about him. "I've never seen such grace under pressure," an elderly man said to his wife. He didn't just protect himself, he upheld the dignity of his role. Emily, who had been among the first to speak out against Jonathan, lingered nearby. She watched Marcus silently and felt a surge of admiration. To her, he wasn't just a guard. He was a symbol of respect, strength, and tradition. The way he had handled the situation made her proud of her country's heritage. Later that evening, Marcus was relieved from his post and returned to the guard's quarters. His commanding officer, a stern but kind man named Captain Rowe, greeted him with a rare smile. "You did well today, Marcus," he said. "I've already received reports from several witnesses about how you handled the incident." Marcus nodded respectfully. "Thank you, sir. I was just doing my duty." Captain Rowe chuckled. "Maybe so, but not everyone can stay calm under that kind of pressure. You've set an example for all of us." Marcus felt a sense of pride at his captain's words. He didn't become a royal guard for fame or recognition, but knowing that his actions had resonated with others gave him a deep sense of fulfillment. Elsewhere in the city, Jonathan was starting to feel the weight of his actions. He tried to scroll past the negative comments, but they were everywhere. His inbox was flooded with messages, some offering advice, others outright condemning him. Even his friends were reaching out, asking what had possessed him to pull such a thoughtless stunt. For the first time, Jonathan began to see things from another perspective. He thought about the guard's unwavering focus and the way the crowd had defended him. He thought about the little girl who had cried and the people who had walked away in disgust. Slowly, a knot of guilt began to form in his chest. "This isn't who I want to be," Jonathan whispered to himself. He looked down at Rex, who was lying quietly at his feet. The dog's eyes were calm, but they seemed to carry a silent question. "What now?" Jonathan sighed. He didn't know the answer yet, but one thing was clear. He couldn't ignore this any longer. Jonathan stood in the middle of the square, grinning as Rex barked louder and louder. The tourists nearby were no longer laughing or taking pictures. They were growing uncomfortable. Some shook their heads in disapproval, while others whispered among themselves. A few people even started recording the scene, not for amusement, but as evidence of Jonathan's disrespectful behavior. Marcus, the royal guard, remained perfectly still. His training had prepared him for moments like this, where people tested his patience and professionalism. Despite the chaos, his focus didn't waver. His grip on his ceremonial weapon stayed firm, his eyes locked straight ahead. To him, this was just another day at work. But Jonathan wasn't satisfied. He wanted more. "Let's step it up, Rex," he said, loosening the leash slightly. The large German shepherd took a step closer to Marcus, barking fiercely. The guard didn't react, but the crowd gasped. A woman in the crowd, visibly upset, called out, "That's enough. Leave him alone." Her voice was firm, But Jonathan barely glanced at her. "It's just a bit of fun," he replied dismissively. "He's a royal guard. He's supposed to handle stuff like this." Another man, standing nearby, crossed his arms and spoke up. "It's not funny. Show some respect." Jonathan smirked and waved his phone at them. "Relax, guys. It's just a video. Don't take life so seriously." He turned his attention back to Rex, giving a quick command for the dog to bark again. Rex obeyed, his booming bark echoing across the square. The tension in the air grew thicker. As the barking continued, a little girl holding her mother's hand began to cry. Her mother glared at Jonathan. "You're scaring the children," she said angrily, pulling her daughter away from the scene. Still, Jonathan refused to back down. He saw the growing crowd as an audience for his prank. "Come on, Rex. Let's get him to move," he said, his tone playful but determined. The dog lunged forward slightly, his leash training in Jonathan's hand. The crowd gasped again, and some people stepped further back, worried about what might happen next. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. Inside, he felt a surge of frustration. He had dealt with disrespectful tourists before, but this felt different. The barking dog and Jonathan's mocking tone weren't just testing his patience, they were testing the dignity of his role as a guard. Yet he held firm, knowing his duty was to remain calm and composed. Suddenly, a voice broke through the crowd. "You need to stop this right now," a young woman said firmly. She stepped forward, her eyes blazing with anger. She was a local, and her pride in the Royal Guards was evident in her voice. "This isn't a joke. You're embarrassing yourself and disrespecting our traditions." Jonathan rolled his eyes. "Relax, lady. It's just a dog barking. No harm done." But the woman wasn't backing down. She pointed to the crying child and the uneasy crowd. "Look around. Do you think this is fun for anyone here? You're ruining the experience for everyone. And for what? A few likes on social media." Jonathan hesitated for a moment, but then shrugged it off. "Whatever," he muttered. "You all need to lighten up." What Jonathan didn't realize was that his actions were about to backfire spectacularly. Karma was closer than he thought, and the crowd was no longer on his side. Jonathan couldn't sleep that night. Lying in bed, he stared at the cracked ceiling of his hotel room, the glow of his broken phone casting faint light across the room. The comments he had read earlier echoed in his mind, each one chipping away at the confidence he had once felt about his prank. For the first time, he began to reflect on what had happened, not from his perspective, but from everyone else's. He thought about the Royal Guard, Marcus as the internet had identified him, and the way he had stood tall despite Jonathan's mocking behavior. The guard didn't flinch, didn't lash out, didn't lose his cool. Instead, he had embodied strength and respect, even when Jonathan had done everything he could to provoke him. Jonathan sighed and sat up, looking down at Rex, who was peacefully asleep at the foot of the bed. "What was I thinking, buddy?" he whispered. "All for a few laughs and likes. Was it really worth it?" Rex's ears twitched in response, but he didn't wake. Jonathan rubbed his face with his hands, feeling a mix of regret and frustration. He hadn't just embarrassed himself. He had disrespected someone who was simply doing their job. And the worst part, he hadn't even thought about it at the time. The next morning, Jonathan woke up with a sense of determination. He knew he couldn't undo what he had done, but he could try to make it right. Pulling out his laptop, he typed a message to the official account of the Royal Guards, apologizing for his behavior and asking if there was any way he could meet Marcus to say sorry in person. Meanwhile, in the guards' quarters, Marcus had just finished his morning briefing with his team. He had seen the viral videos of the incident, but hadn't paid them much attention. To him, the day before was just another part of his duty, and he wasn't interested in the internet's opinions. As he was heading to his post, Captain Rowe approached him with a message in hand. "Marcus," the captain said, "you've got something here you might want to read." Marcus took the paper and read it carefully. It was Jonathan's message. The apology was sincere, and it was clear from the tone that the tourist regretted his actions. Marcus raised an eyebrow. He had dealt with many disrespectful tourists before, but this was the first time one had reached out to apologize. "What do you think, sir?" Marcus asked. Captain Rose smiled faintly. "I think it's up to you, Marcus. If you feel it's worth your time, I can arrange a meeting." Marcus thought for a moment before nodding. "Let's do it. Maybe this is a chance to teach him something." Later that day, Jonathan received a reply inviting him to meet Marcus in a small office near the castle grounds. His heart pounded as he read the message. Part of him was relieved, but another part was terrified. What if Marcus refused to forgive him? What if he made things worse? Despite his nerves, Jonathan knew this was the right thing to do. Gathering his courage, he grabbed Rex's leash and headed out. It was time to face the consequences of his actions and make things right. Jonathan's palms were sweaty as he approached the office near the castle grounds. Rex walked quietly by his side, his leash held firmly in Jonathan's trembling hand. The morning air was crisp, but Jonathan barely noticed. His mind raced with thoughts of how this meeting might go. Would Marcus accept his apology? Would he even be willing to listen? When Jonathan arrived at the small office, a guard greeted him and directed him to a waiting room. "Mr. Marcus will be here shortly," the guard said, his tone polite but firm. Jonathan nodded, his heart pounding. He sat on a chair near the window, glancing nervously at Rex, who wagged his tail and looked up at him as if to say, "You've got this." A few minutes later, the door opened, and Marcus stepped in. He was still in uniform, his posture as upright and professional as ever. His expression was calm, but his eyes were sharp, observing Jonathan closely. Jonathan stood up quickly, his voice stumbling over his words. "Hi. Thank you for agreeing to meet me," he said, extending a hand awkwardly. Marcus nodded, ignoring the handshake, but keeping his demeanor polite. "Let's sit," he said, motioning toward the chairs. As they sat across from each other, the room felt tense. Jonathan took a deep breath, deciding to dive straight into what he needed to say. "I wanted to apologize," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "What I did yesterday, it was wrong. I didn't think about how it would affect you or anyone else. I just thought it would be funny. But now I realize how disrespectful it was, to you, to your job, and to the tradition you represent." Marcus listened quietly, his expression unreadable. Jonathan continued, feeling the need to say more. "I was so caught up in trying to make a video that I didn't stop to think about how my actions might hurt others. And seeing the way you handled everything with such patience and dignity, it really made me realize how foolish I was. I'm sorry, truly." The room fell silent for a moment. Jonathan's heart pounded as he waited for Marcus's response. Finally, Marcus leaned forward slightly, his calm voice breaking the quiet. "I appreciate your apology," Marcus said. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. What you did yesterday wasn't just disrespectful to me. It was disrespectful to the values we stand for. But I can see that you've taken the time to reflect on your actions, and that means something." Jonathan's shoulders relaxed slightly, relief washing over him. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "I know I can't undo what I did, but if there's any way I can make it right, I'm willing to try." Marcus gave a small nod. "What matters most is that you've learned from this experience. Respect is not just about following rules. It's about understanding the importance of the things we hold dear. If you truly understand that now, then you've already started making it right." Jonathan felt a weight lift off his chest. Marcus's words were calm but impactful, and they carried a wisdom that Jonathan couldn't ignore. "I'll do better," he said, his voice firm. "Not just here, but everywhere." As the meeting ended, Marcus extended his hand, and Jonathan shook it, feeling a newfound respect for the man he had once mocked. As he walked out of the office with Rex by his side, Jonathan realized that this experience had changed him. He had come to Wellingford for a vacation, but he was leaving with something far more valuable. A lesson in respect, humility, and the power of making amends. Jonathan was excited. He had finally saved enough money for his dream vacation to the historic city of Wellingford. Known for its grand castles, cobblestone streets, and the famous royal guards, the city drew tourists from all over the world. These guards were legendary, standing perfectly still, showing no emotion, no matter what happened around them. Jonathan had seen videos of people trying to make the guards laugh or react, and he found it hilarious. "This is my chance to go viral," he thought as he wandered through the crowded streets with his dog, Rex, a large, energetic German shepherd. The castle square was bustling with activity. Tourists were taking pictures, kids were laughing, and street performers were entertaining the crowd. But the main attraction was the Royal Guard, standing tall in their traditional red uniforms and black hats, holding their ceremonial weapons. They didn't flinch as people posed next to them, made funny faces, or even shouted in their ears. Jonathan smirked as he stood in front of one of the guards, a tall black man named Marcus. Marcus's calm, focused demeanor caught Jonathan's attention. "Let's see how good you really are at staying still," Jonathan muttered to himself, tightening Rex's leash. Jonathan had always enjoyed getting reactions from people. Whether it was pranking his friends or pulling stunts in public, he loved being the center of attention. And now, with his phone in hand, he was ready to record what he thought would be his most entertaining video yet. "Let's have some fun, Rex," Jonathan said, crouching down to whisper to his dog. Rex wagged his tail, ready to obey whatever his owner wanted. Jonathan began encouraging Rex to bark, pointing him toward Marcus. At first, nothing happened. The guard remained motionless, his expression unchanging. People nearby noticed Jonathan's actions and began whispering among themselves. A few disapproved, shaking their heads, but no one intervened. Jonathan, however, was too focused on his prank to care. "Come on, Rex. Bark louder," he said, giving the leash a slight tug. Rex barked once, then twice, his deep voice echoing in the square. Jonathan laughed, certain that Marcus would react, but the guard didn't move a muscle. The crowd started to grow uneasy. Some tourists moved away, while others pulled out their phones, recording the scene. A middle-aged woman muttered, "How disrespectful," but Jonathan didn't hear her. He was too busy trying to get Rex to bark even louder. Marcus remained calm, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He had been trained for moments like this, to stay focused no matter what distractions came his way. "Wow, this guy's good," Jonathan joked to himself, turning his phone to record the crowd as if to capture their reactions too. But what he didn't realize was that the crowd wasn't amused. Whispers turned into murmurs, and a sense of tension filled the air. One man stepped forward and said firmly, "Hey, leave him alone. That's not funny." Jonathan looked over his shoulder and smirked. "Relax. It's just a joke," he said, brushing off the man's concern. But what Jonathan didn't know was that karma was already on its way. Jonathan stormed out of the square, his dog Rex trailing behind with his tail tucked between his legs. His cheeks burned with embarrassment as the sound of the crowd's laughter still rang in his ears. His broken phone sat uselessly in his pocket, and he couldn't stop replaying the moment when he slipped and fell in front of everyone. "This isn't fair," he muttered to himself, glaring at Rex. "You were supposed to help me go viral, not ruin everything." Rex looked up at him with big, innocent eyes, unaware of Jonathan's frustration. The dog's earlier aggression had completely vanished, and he now walked obediently, as if sensing his owner's bad mood. Back in the square, the crowd was buzzing with excitement. Tourists exchanged stories about what had just happened, their admiration for Marcus growing with every word. Many of them had recorded the incident, and their videos were already being uploaded to social media. In one corner of the square, the young woman who had confronted Jonathan earlier stood with a group of locals. Her name was Emily, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride as she talked about Marcus. "He handled that so well," Emily said, smiling. Did you see the way he stopped that dog without even touching it? That takes real skill. One of the locals nodded. It's not just skill, it's discipline. These guards go through years of training to make sure they can handle situations like that. But honestly, that tourist was way out of line. Emily sighed. People like him don't understand what these guards represent. It's not just about standing still. It's about honoring tradition and showing respect for something bigger than yourself. As they talked, Marcus continued to stand in his position, his face calm and focused. But inside, he felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. He hadn't done anything extraordinary, just his job. But the crowd's reaction reminded him of why he had chosen this path. Meanwhile, Jonathan made his way to a quiet park bench, far from the square. He sat down heavily and took out his broken phone, examining the cracked screen with a scowl. His plan to go viral had completely backfired, and now he was the one who looked like a fool. He opened the social media app on his phone, hoping to find something to distract him from his bad mood. Instead, he was greeted by a flood of videos from the square. His heart sank as he saw himself in every clip, taunting Marcus, encouraging Rex to bark, and finally slipping and falling. The captions were brutal. Disrespectful tourist gets what he deserves. Royal Guard shows grace under pressure. Tourist fails miserably. This is what happens when you mock tradition. Jonathan's hands trembled as he read through the comments. People from all over the world were calling him out for his behavior. Some were even demanding that he apologize to Marcus and the crowd. "This can't be happening," he whispered, his voice shaky. "It was just a joke. People need to calm down." But deep down, Jonathan knew that he had crossed a line. The prank he thought would make him famous had instead shown the world his lack of respect. And now, the whole world was watching. As the sun began to set, Jonathan sat on the bench, staring at his phone. For the first time, he started to wonder if he had made a mistake. Jonathan stepped out of the small office, the cool breeze brushing against his face. Rex trotted beside him, wagging his tail, oblivious to the emotions running through Jonathan's mind. For the first time in days, Jonathan felt a sense of clarity. The knot of guilt that had weighed him down since the incident was beginning to loosen. As he walked through the bustling streets of Wellingford, Jonathan noticed things he hadn't paid attention to before. The beauty of the old architecture, the laughter of children playing, the pride in the locals' faces as they spoke about their city. He had been so focused on his own goals, his desire for attention, that he had missed everything that made this place special. Later that afternoon, Jonathan decided to visit the square where it had all started. The area was quieter now, with only a few tourists strolling around and admiring the castle. The royal guards were back at their posts, standing tall and still as ever. Among them, he spotted Marcus. Jonathan didn't approach him this time. He simply stood at a respectful distance, watching in quiet admiration. Marcus's presence carried a sense of dignity and strength that Jonathan hadn't appreciated before. It was clear that his role wasn't just about standing still. It was about embodying the values of respect, tradition, and discipline. As Jonathan stood there, a family approached the guards. A young boy with a wide smile posed for a picture next to Marcus, while his parents stood nearby, beaming with pride. The scene was simple, yet it spoke volumes. For the family, this was more than just a photo. It was a memory, a moment that would stay with them forever. Jonathan turned to leave, feeling inspired. He had learned an important lesson, one that would stay with him long after his trip ended. Respect wasn't just about words or gestures. It was about understanding and valuing the things that were meaningful to others. It was about seeing beyond yourself and recognizing the impact of your actions. That evening, Jonathan took to social media, but not for the reasons he once would have. Instead of chasing likes or attention, he decided to share his story, not as a way to excuse his behavior, but to show others what he had learned. In a heartfelt post, Jonathan wrote, "A few days ago, I made a mistake. I disrespected someone who was simply doing their job, and in doing so, I disrespected an entire tradition. At the time, I thought it was just a harmless joke, but I've since realized how wrong I was. The royal guard who I mocked showed more patience and grace than I could ever deserve, and I want to publicly apologize for my actions. This experience has taught me the value of respect, not just for people, but for the traditions and cultures that shape who we are. I hope others can learn from my mistake and remember to treat others with kindness and understanding. The post quickly gained attention, but this time, the comments were different. People commended Jonathan for owning up to his mistake and using his platform to share a meaningful lesson. Marcus's professionalism and dignity were also celebrated, with many calling him a role model. As Jonathan prepared to leave Wellingford the next day, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't expected. He hadn't just visited a new place, he had grown as a person. And as he boarded his train with Rex by his side, he knew one thing for sure. He would carry this lesson with him, wherever life took him next. Jonathan stood there, still grinning as if he had just performed the world's funniest joke. Rex barked again, loud and sharp, as the tension in the air became unbearable. The crowd was no longer whispering. They were openly upset, their expressions filled with disgust and disapproval. But Jonathan didn't care. To him, this was just harmless fun, and he was convinced that his prank would make him a social media star. "Come on, Rex," Jonathan said, giving the leash another tug. "Let's see if this guy is really unshakable." Marcus, the royal guard, remained motionless. But behind his steady gaze, he could feel the weight of the situation. He knew that his role as a symbol of tradition and discipline was being mocked, and the crowd's frustration wasn't just about the barking dog. It was about the lack of respect for something they deeply valued. Suddenly, Rex seemed to sense the growing tension. The dog stopped barking and began growling instead, his ears pinned back. The crowd stepped back further, sensing that something was about to go wrong. "Whoa, Rex, calm down," Jonathan said, his grin fading slightly. He tugged on the leash, but Rex didn't budge. The dog's growl grew louder, his sharp teeth visible as he stared at Marcus. Jonathan laughed nervously, trying to shake off the unease creeping into his mind. "He's just playing," he said to no one in particular. But Rex wasn't playing. Without warning, the dog lunged forward, pulling the leash out of Jonathan's hand. The crowd gasped in shock as the large German shepherd charged straight toward Marcus. In a split second, Marcus shifted his stance, moving with a swiftness that surprised everyone. With a commanding voice, he said, "Stand down." His tone was firm, and his presence exuded authority. Rex skidded to a halt, confused by the sudden display of power. The dog whimpered and backed away, unsure of what to do next. The crowd erupted into applause, cheering for Marcus's quick reflexes and calm handling of the situation. But karma wasn't done yet. As Jonathan scrambled to grab Rex's leash, he slipped on the cobblestone pavement and fell flat on his back. His phone flew out of his hand and landed with a loud crack on the ground. The crowd couldn't hold back their laughter this time. What had started as a tense and uncomfortable scene was now a moment of poetic justice. Jonathan, now sitting on the ground with a broken phone and a bruised ego, looked around in disbelief. "What's so funny?" he muttered, but the crowd's laughter drowned out his words. One man stepped forward, a smirk on his face. "That's karma, mate. You mess with tradition, and it bites back. Literally." Jonathan's cheeks burned with embarrassment. He grabbed Rex's leash and muttered under his breath, "Let's get out of here." The dog followed, his tail between his legs, as the crowd continued to cheer for Marcus. Marcus, ever composed, returned to his position, standing tall and proud. He didn't need to say a word. His actions had spoken louder than anything Jonathan could have done, and the crowd's admiration said it all. As Jonathan slinked away, the young woman who had spoken up earlier called out, "Maybe next time you'll think before you act." The crowd applauded her words, and Jonathan quickened his pace, eager to disappear from sight.